Thank you, Erko, and thank you to Mark for inviting me to speak here. I feel, as a historian, somewhat nervous standing up in front of you with a title saying, "What can history teach us about the future?" It reminds me slightly of those warnings that your financial advisor gives you about, past performance being no guide to future performance. And, of course, as a historian, I can't predict the future for you. But I think that we're at the stage in scholarly publishing where we're not looking to see what the future unfolds, but we're actually trying to shape the way that the future of scholarly publishing is going. There's a lot of new experiments out there. There's a lot of new efforts to do something different in scholarly publishing. And when we're looking at how to reshape, how to redesign the processes and practices of scholarly publishing, then I do think that looking to the past can be helpful to think about, how can we do it this way? Is this the natural and right way to do it, or maybe there's an alternative way to do it that we've forgotten about, or that or that didn't work out for some reason that may now be possible that we haven't thought about it recently. Now, I'm going to be talking about journal publishing, and I feel slightly guilty about this as a historian who herself writes monographs, but I'm afraid I'm going to talk about journal publishing because that's what my research project's about. I'm going to start with a little history of and some comments on the history of scientific journals, scholarly journals more broadly. And then I want to look at two particular areas where I think the history can very much help us. Those two areas are the business models of scholarly publishing and the use of peer review in scholarly publishing. So that's where we're going. So I am currently working on the Philosophical Transactions, the world's oldest scientific journal, the world's oldest scholarly journal. It's 350 years old this year, and I've been involved with the Royal Society's celebrations earlier this year, as some people in this room were as well, to celebrate this. But I think there are some issues with thinking too much about 1665 as a key date in scholarly publishing. If you want, by the way, to know my longer thoughts on this, some of the outputs from my project, we've got an exhibition brochure that you can get online, and there's a special issue of Notes and Records of the Royal Society that you can presumably get online as well, if you want to know more. But anyway, if we look at 1665, what happened then was that a man called Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary to this newfangled organisation, the Royal Society, decided to set up a monthly news sheet. He created this new genre. The monthly news sheet focused on natural philosophy, as it was then called, science you would now call it. This is at a time when the periodical is actually still quite a new genre in and of itself as well. So it's quite an innovative idea. And this journal that Oldenburg started has since become the official journal of the Royal Society of London. The reason I want to downplay 1665, despite having helped celebrate it, is that so many of the features we associate with the modern scholarly journal didn't arise in 1665. And I think if you overplay 1665, you make it seem as if, right, it was invented back then and nothing's changed since. And what I want to tell you today is that actually a lot of things have changed since then. So, for instance, things that have changed. Well, what about the idea that the research being published should be original? What about the idea that the research should be written by the person who actually did the research? What about the use of refereeing? What about the increasing use of standardised structure and style for scholarly articles? These are all developments not of the 17th century, but of the 19th century. Or what about things that you'll all be familiar with in scholarly publishing now, the increased use of English as the international language of science, not so much in the humanities, but certainly the sciences, the high profits that are being made by many publishers who publish scholarly journals, the increasing professionalism of those who edit and manage scholarly journals. These are all 20th century innovations. And so too is the widespread use of peer review and the claim that peer review is crucial to the making of scientific knowledge. These are not things that have been around since 1665. These are things that have developed since then. And one of the things I want to bring out today is why did they develop? And get you thinking about the fact that these are not necessary parts of scientific or scholarly publishing. They are contingent, they've arisen for particular reasons, perhaps to suit contexts that are now different. So that's where we're going. So in 1665, we had one scholarly journal in the world. The simple history since then goes, then there were lots more. And I'm sure you've seen variants of the modern figures I've given here. It's actually really difficult to get good historical figures on how many scholarly journals or scientific journals, depending which you're interested in, at any point in time. It's somewhat possible to get numbers of new journals set up, but there was a very high attrition rate for new journals. So if you actually want to know how many were actually in action at any one point in time, these are ballpark figures and nothing more. But I put them up there just to give you a sense of the rate of growth that we're dealing with here. Now, why? One reason why there were so many new journals set up was to do with the growth of societies and academies. The Royal Society was one of the first of a new breed of organisation, shortly followed by the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris and various others, including, of course, this one in 1808. These new societies and academies had an increasing tendency to think that a publication was a good thing for a society or an academy to have. Whether you call it the memoir, whether you call it the transactions or the proceedings, societies have publications. And as the societies spread across Europe in the 18th century, so you've got Stockholm in the middle, but in the 19th century they spread across the world. We get national academies and scientific societies set up in South America, you've got Argentina on the end there, in Yokohama, in Tokyo, in Beijing. We're getting new societies and thus new journals set up all over the world. And more than that, of course, is not just the national societies, there's also the specialist societies. With the beginning of the 19th century, you start to see a trend to have the Astronomical Society, the Geological Society, the Royal Chemical Society, the Microscopical Society, etc., continue that into the 20th century. And guess what? They all have journals as well. So one of the reasons for the big expansion in journals is the expansion of societies, both geographically and in terms of specialism. But of course, that's only part of the story, because the other part of the story is the non-society journals, the independent journals that were also emerging. Now remember, Oldenburg's Philosophical Transactions started out its life as an independent journal. It's only since become associated with the Royal Society in 1752. More on that in a moment. Now, we think that in the 18th and 19th century, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all journals started were independent ones, set up either by scholars who saw an opportunity for perhaps a little bit of fame and reputation building by becoming an editor, or perhaps a little supplement to their impoverished professorial salaries. Those sorts of journals being set up. And also where booksellers or printers saw a niche in the market and saw perhaps an opportunity to sell to the growing interest in natural philosophy, natural history, and the natural sciences. These new journals had an awful tendency to be quite short-lived. The 18th century statistics suggest that if you want to last for more than about 10 years, you're much, much better off being a society journal than you are being an independent journal. But by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, around about the 1780s, 1790s, we do start to see a handful of editors who've managed to work out the formula for success for non-society journals. So people like Lawrence Krell of Chemische Annalen, Alexander Tilloch at Philosophical Magazine, and Norman Lockyer at Nature at the end there. What's happening in those cases is that they're realizing how to sell natural philosophy to a paying audience, and they're managing to make enough sales that they are actually managing to survive vaguely in the long term. I mean, Nature and Philosophical Magazine go on way beyond their original editors, their long-term successes. Before I go any further, I just want to reflect a little bit on the differences between society journals and independent journals. You'll probably be thinking, well, not-for-profit and profit-making. Yep, fair enough, but there are some other differences too that will come out in what I'm saying later. So society journals have communities behind them. They have communities of scholars behind them. Those journals, in some sense, represent those communities. They represent the disciplines that those societies represent. They also, by the way, have access to quite a lot of volunteer manpower, which is useful if you're trying to set up systems of editorial committees, editorial board, refereeing, these kinds of things. If you're a society, you've got an obvious pool of people to be involved in that, which the independent journals don't have. The independent journals don't represent communities. If anything, they represent their editors. All of them, all the successful ones, I should say, all the successful ones have strong editorial personas behind them. These are people who very much shape the contents of their journals. And one indication of the strength of the editorial persona is the way that so many of these journals in the early 19th century were linked with the names of their editors. So people talked about Krell's journal, they talked about Thomson's Annalen, they talked about Poggendorf's and Silliman's journal, as if these were the names of the journals. The other, apart from the community editor thing, the other key difference for these independent journals is, I think, the fact that they have to focus on what will sell, because that's how they are supported financially. They're selling to paying customers. And it's going to become obvious that what I'm going to say about societies is that they have a different business model. So it means that the contents of these journals tends to be a little bit different. The learned societies tend to focus on original research papers, but the independent journals are much more likely to have miscellaneous contents, news, reviews, correspondence, debate, controversy, lots of different types of content. That's part of what makes them more sellable than they might otherwise have been. I feel that it's worth just re-emphasising some of those distinctions, because I think they're distinctions that have become blurred more recently, now that we see the learned societies paying more attention to the commercial aspects of their journal publishing. And of course, journal publishing is now an income stream for many, many of our learned societies, which, as you'll see, was simply not true historically. But also we see that the newsier independent journals have also taken on a different place in the research community. The fact that a nature paper now matters a lot to people's CV is something that was not historically true. So we're seeing a blurring from both sides of that divide. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about business models and how these journals were funded or not as things went by. So let's start with the independent journals, because after all, Oldenburg's philosophical transactions started out as his personal plan. Oldenburg, you have to understand, was a German émigré in London, not particularly well off, had decided that there was a way to make some money out of his position as secretary to the Royal Society, and also the fact that he himself had an enormous European-wide correspondence network. So he turned that to money-making potential by producing a printed monthly news sheet of goings-on in the world of scholarship. But in reality, he was somewhat disappointed with this as a plan. We have very scattered evidence, mostly from Oldenburg's correspondence, where he remarks things like, it barely made enough to cover the rent on his house in Piccadilly. It implies, notice, that he did make some money, just nothing like as much as he was wanting to make from it. But it's that sort of scattered reference that we have. Fortunately for Oldenburg, he shortly thereafter married someone who brought him money, and money problems ceased to be an issue for him personally. But from what we know of the subsequent editors after his death, it seems that Oldenburg may have been the last person to make any money from philosophical transactions for about the next 200 years, possibly even 300 years, actually. Just an example I've got up here is Hans Sloane, early 18th century. He's the man whose collections form the foundation of the British Museum in London. He was a very wealthy man. He was also the editor of Philosophical Transactions for some time. And he afterwards said that he reckoned he'd spent about £1,500 of his own money supporting the transactions. Now, most people would not have been able to afford that, so that's why it's significant that Sloane was rich. So when we get on to the 19th century, we see again this expectation that scientific journals nobody's expecting them to make a lot of money. Here is Richard Taylor, of the firm that will become Taylor and Francis, giving evidence to Parliament, actually about something different, but commenting that scientific journals are supported with very great difficulty. He's witnessed in his own recollection a failure of all the scientific journals, almost, that have been set on foot, and they've failed from an inability to cover their expenses. Now, there is actually something a little ironic about Richard Taylor making this claim, because he himself was the editor and owner of the Philosophical Magazine that we saw a moment ago, which was, in fact, a surviving and successful journal. So it raises the question of what was it that Taylor was doing that meant that he was bucking the trend, when apparently everyone else was setting up these journals enthusiastically and then they're falling by the wayside quite rapidly. So what's Taylor doing? We'll have a little look at that for a moment. But it becomes Taylor and Francis in the 1850s when William Francis, who's the illegitimate son of Richard Taylor, becomes taken into partnership. So that's where Taylor and Francis comes from. One of the things that Richard Taylor can do, and that Taylor and Francis go on to do, is they have more in their business than just one journal. Quite a lot of the independent journals are set up where one-man shows, essentially. Not true of Philosophical Magazine or the other ones published by Taylor and Francis. For a start, they're a printing organisation as well as a publishing one, and that contract printing for learned society transactions, for instance, but also for university exam papers. There's quite a lucrative source of income in that contract printing, and it means that the firm has that steady income stream coming in to underwrite what they're doing in journal publishing. But more than that, these contacts with universities and with learned societies are very useful to the editor of Philosophical Magazine when he's thinking every month, there's a copy deadline, I need stuff to put in my journal. Well, fortunately, he knows a lot of people in the learned and scholarly community in Britain, and that is how he gets the content to fill the journal. And there's also various possibilities for reuse of material between one journal and another. So you can have stuff typeset for one journal and then reuse it in another journal. So there are some cost savings of having multiple printing contracts going on. So that's one thing that Taylor does. Another thing that Taylor does is something that will be somewhat familiar in the modern context. We'd now call it acquisitions and mergers. But one possible reason why so many of the journals went under in the early 19th century is because the market wasn't big enough to sustain that many journals. And so something that Richard Taylor made a point of doing was buying up the rivals. Not immediately, and I don't think many of them would be called hostile takeovers, but we're looking at journals which were struggling on and then get an offer from Taylor to come and join the Philosophical Magazine. It leaves its mark in the title of Philosophical Magazine when, for instance, it becomes London, Edinburgh and Dublin Philosophical Magazine, and it's Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science. You notice the last one it took over was the Edinburgh Journal of Science, so the merger of titles. There's also an acquisition of more editorial talent. David Brewster, for instance, who appears on the right as one of the editors, had originally been the editor of the Edinburgh Journal and was brought on board through these mergers. So Taylor acquires quite a dominant position in natural philosophy publishing, and also separately with a different journal in natural history publishing in the 19th century. And the other thing that Taylor can do, and I think this is because he comes from a printing and book trade background rather than a scholarly background, as quite a lot of the other editors came from, he knows the book trade. He knows what sort of things sell. One of the things he knows, for instance, is the importance of coming out at a regular time every month, which most learned societies did not achieve by any manner of means, coming out regularly, having a fixed cover price so you can get a fixed regular repeat custom. But having a fixed cover price implies that you've almost certainly got a fixed page length as well, because that's how you maintain your cover price. These are things that the learned societies did not do, but things that if you want to make a commercial success, it's probably quite a good idea to do. And he also had a good eye for what would actually sell, what was marketable. So he has correspondence columns, not just from Britain. This particular example is from, as you can see, is from Connecticut. There are reports from learned society meetings. There's even weather reports. And there are research articles. But I've put 3 examples up at the bottom just to get you thinking about what a research article might mean in this middle of the 19th century period. The first one has a note saying communicated by the authors. But the next 2, neither of them are first announced here. One of them has been reported already in Berlin, and another one of them has already been presented to the Royal Society in Edinburgh. So the idea that originality might be important isn't there. What's important here is that for the readers of Philosophical Magazine, they don't know this stuff yet because they weren't in that room in Edinburgh, or they can't read the German language publication. So it's new to the readers, not necessarily new to the global world of scholarship. It's a different definition of what matters. Now, it's difficult to know how much money Taylor actually made from the Philosophical Magazine. My strong suspicion is that most of the firm's money came from the contract printing operations and not from the journal publishing. But I'm afraid that is only a suspicion. What I wanted to demonstrate is the fact that it was not straightforward to make profits out of scholarly journals in this period. If you're wondering incidentally about Nature, your trivial pursuit fact about Nature is that it took 20 years before Nature started turning a profit for Macmillan. But you can perhaps see now why journals that have a sponsorship from a society might be more likely to survive in the long term. But notice that what I've said implies then that the societies are financially supporting those journals to make up the gap that retail sales aren't doing. So let's look at the finances of society journals for a bit. I've spent rather too long recently thinking about this sort of thing. See my notes and records paper if you really want more figures and facts. But here, to cut to the chase, is the figures from the Royal Society after they took over philosophical transactions. I would just like to draw your attention to the gap between the blue, which is sales income, and the red, which is production costs. And you will notice that there is a gap, and it's the wrong way round for any of you who are thinking commercially. So, for a large chunk of its history, philosophical transactions was not making money for the Royal Society any more than it had made money for Oldenburg and his successors as editors. So when we, as historians, think about why did the Royal Society take over the journal in 1752, were they hoping to get more income? Well, obviously they weren't. They knew fine well that taking on the transactions formally was not going to be a source of income. Rather, it was going to be a charge on the society. They discuss this in the council minutes, so we do know something about what was going on. Also notice in this quotation, we've got the idea that the philosophical transactions so printed shall be for the sole use and benefit of the society. Now, it's quite easy to read that in modern terminology as expecting that the society will pay all the bills and will take all the profit, but that assumes that there is any profit coming. In fact, sole use and benefit has to be read in a different way, and this will become obvious to you in a little while. But just bear that one in mind for a moment. So if the society is going to support this journal, which they have decided to do, how are they going to do it? There are some national academies around the world, in France, say, which are state-funded, and therefore can, in fact, fund their publications and use them as gifts to demonstrate the largesse of the French king and the wonders of French scholarship. The Royal Society, however, is a voluntary society, and it's got membership subscriptions. So it's perhaps not surprising that the discussion they have in 1752 is that it is but reasonable that fellows shall contribute in some measure towards defraying the said extraordinary expense of publishing. So we have set up a link between membership subscriptions funding the journal publishing. And that seems to have been relatively straightforward to agree in 1752, and indeed for the next century or so, it seems to have been relatively straightforward. But by the time we get into the later 19th century, it's running into problems for a couple of reasons. One is that by the middle of the 19th century, the membership size of the society was getting smaller because it was becoming more elitist. You now had to actually demonstrate some competence and expertise in science, ideally by having published a journal article. But anyway, some measure of competence to be elected to the society. So the membership gets smaller as you cut out all the people who don't qualify anymore. And moreover, those people are much less likely to be rich aristocrats and wealthy gentlemen. They're actually much more likely to be some of those cash-strapped university professors. So we've got a smaller membership of poorer people, which is not a great basis for funding a publication that is growing increasingly expensive. Production costs just keep going up through the 19th century. And if any of you know anything about the publishing history of the 19th century, you should be going, hang on, but the 19th century is the period of industrialization in the print trades. It's the period of steam-powered printing. It's the period of stereotyping. It's the period of linotype and monotype composition machines. Unit costs were going down in the print trade, most sections of print trade, in the 19th century. Why are the Royal Society's costs going up? And the answer is not to do with technology at all. It's to do with what they're printing. Oh, sorry, there's my rising costs graph you were supposed to be looking at. You can see they had a bit of a crisis in the middle of the 1890s when the costs really were going through the roof. Why were they doing that? Because they were publishing more. The growing professionalization of science was changing the nature of scientific publishing and would later change scholarly publishing more broadly. More people are producing research, they're wanting to publish it, and they want to publish it in greater detail. So here's just a couple of stats to make my point. From 1765, 1838 and 1908, you'll see that the number of articles being published in Philtrans isn't consistently going up. But what is going up is the number of pages being printed and the number of illustrations therein. Particularly look at the 73 illustrations in 1908. It's a huge increase from 1765. That's why production costs are going up, not because of changes in technology. Now, if, of course, they had been a commercial publisher with a page limit, this wouldn't have been possible. But they are a learned society committed to the furtherance of research and committed to publishing the best research. So more good research comes in, we're going to publish it. And, oh dear, that means it gets more and more expensive. That's why they have a bit of a problem financially in the 1890s. And thus we get the Secretary of the Society appealing to Her Majesty's Treasury, saying that scientific journals are not profitable undertakings, just as Richard Taylor had been saying 60 years earlier. And he points out that this is the case, even though, can I just point out, the contributors to these magazines don't get paid anything, but the expenses are so great, illustrations, technical typesetting, and the public is so small. Oh, and by the way, advertising income is non-existent. And so scientific journals are carried on with great difficulty and at a loss. And he goes on to say, and mostly by learned societies. Because he's writing this appeal to the Treasury, not just for the Royal Society, but on behalf of all the British learned societies who are all struggling at this point in time. The results of this appeal, it's successful. They get a government grant to subsidise scholarly publications, both at the Royal Society and other societies, that's in place for the next several decades. So we now do finally get state funding of scholarly publishing in the 1890s. But you might be wondering, what about sales income? Because you could be less worried about rising production costs if your sales income was rising to match. It's, rising production costs in and of itself, not necessarily a problem if sales go up. Well, estimating sales from the data I've got from the archive is somewhat tricky, to say the least. I do have sales income for a number of periods, but translating that into unit sales is tricky for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that there was no set price for the publication. But those are my best guesses, top line. So you'll see that actually sales appear to be going down across the 19th century, even though there's a growth in scientific enterprise. But would you notice also the other two lines? Because that's the significant thing for an open access discussion, is the amount of the print run that was not being sold on the open market. In fact, the Royal Society was giving a free copy to every fellow of the Society, and also to a substantial number of other institutions, and more of them by the end of the century. So it means that pretty much every British university library was getting a free copy of Philosophical Transactions, as were most national academies around the world, as were many observatories around the world. And just so you know, this isn't just Britain. I mean, there's the geographical breakdown of where these things are going by 1908. There's a lot of free circulation of knowledge happening through the largesse of the Royal Society. This is why sales are so low, because after all, you have just killed off your natural market by giving free copies to all the university libraries and to most of the scholars who might want to read it. But they're not thinking in terms of commercial model here. They're thinking in terms of how do we get the best research that the Society publishes out to audiences, not just throughout Britain, but throughout the world. Remember I talked about use or benefit, and how I said it's not financial benefit. There is a benefit to the Society's reputation in doing this sort of thing. There is actually also an in-kind benefit, because most of the institutions they send their publications to send them back again. This is why send their own publications back. And this is why the Royal Society has now built up one of the best collections of scientific journals in the world because of their extensive exchange scheme. And they did it without direct financial cost. Obviously, there's an indirect cost, but that's how they get that. And the other benefit is to scholarship, that the Society is supposed to be promoting and furthering scientific scholarship. And one way to do that is by enabling access to research, which is what this scheme is supposed to be doing. So there are benefits, but they're just not financial ones. Now, obviously, it's a very laudable desire to circulate knowledge like this, but it did come a cropper with it's the scalability thing again, and it's the cost of print and paper. More on that in a bit. In case you're wondering, it's not until the 20th century that the Royal Society seriously started to cut back its free circulation list and try to increase sales instead. And like other societies and other commercial publishers, it benefited hugely from the post-war increase in science funding and the increase in library budgets, which is when we see scholarly publishing starting to become seriously profitable. So I'd just like to remind you that the circulation of knowledge from a society perspective now is often seen commercially, because so many of our societies now have pretty professional publishing departments. But you could see the circulation of knowledge as part of the philanthropic mission of the Society, if you're willing to have that discussion about how you're going to fund it and find other ways to do that. Seeing the circulation of knowledge as a commercial transaction is barely 50 years old, which in my terms is not very old at all, though you may think in different time frames. Anyway, enough on publishing models for a bit. Let's look at peer review, which is the other one I want to show you how recent things are, basically. And I've written about this in Times Higher, as some of you might know. Now, peer review is very often said to be fundamental to scientific knowledge, and often said to be dated back to 1665, along with everything else. And I'm going to show you that has some truth in it, but masks a lot of the more interesting truths that you wouldn't see. So let's look at 6 key moments in the history of scientific journal publishing, and my apologies to those of you who heard a longer version of this at Alps last week. It's basically the same 6 moments, but there you go. Some of you didn't hear me last week. So in 1665, the question of who makes editorial decisions, who decides and on what basis, is relatively simple. It's Henry Oldenburg. He's the editor, he's in charge, he decides what goes into the journal. However, there is another layer of oversight on it, because there's no such thing as a free press in early modern Europe. There are state licensing and censorship requirements in place. And the Royal Society is a rather strange beast, unusual and special, in that it has the right to be a licensing body without going through the standard state licensing bodies. So it means that the Royal Society's president, acting on behalf of the Society corporately, can license publications. So that means that there is some degree of oversight of Henry Oldenburg's Philosophical Transactions, because he's using the license of the Royal Society rather than the license from the Stationers' Company to get published. So we've got oversight. That's why you have the phrase imprimatur, or licensed for, appearing on the early issues of Philosophical Transactions. But I'd just like to point out to you what basis that oversight is done on. What the license is granted on is that there's no blasphemy or sedition or treason in it, nothing dangerous to the state. Now that, you'll notice, is a little bit different from what peer review nowadays tends to do. So that's why I emphasize it's different. Okay. But let's fast forward to 1752, when the Royal Society, remember, took over the transactions. And one of the things that learned societies tend to do is set up committees, and of course they set up an editorial committee to manage the transactions. And this is an important moment because it means that the responsibility for what goes into the transactions is no longer one man's responsibility, and it was a man all this time, but it was committee decision. It was collective, in some sense corporate, if you will. These decisions in some way represent the society. Remember what I was saying about communities earlier? So we've now got a whole group of people involved. They're all, in fact, council members of the society, but at least it's more than one person. And one of the big reasons that the society took over the journal was because they were worried about potential reputational damage if the single editor was biased, prejudiced, ignorant, incompetent, or indeed actually long-term ill and not able to do his job. So having a committee provided protection for the society's good name. So there's an awful lot of reputational stuff going on there. Now, what did this committee do? Well, they took votes. You want to try that? You get everybody around a table and you take votes on the basis of the abstract of the paper, not the full text of the paper, because it doesn't work very well in a committee meeting trying to get everyone to read the full text. They looked at the abstracts and they voted. What they're voting on is not the intellectual content and truth value of the paper, but is it going to embarrass the society, broadly speaking. So perpetual motion schemes had been outlawed for decades before this, but we see a decrease in things like monstrous births, women giving birth to rabbits, children vomiting worms, these kinds of things that are now seen as being beneath the dignity of a Royal Society publication and don't get published anymore. And one of the interesting things that happens after 1752 is the inclusion of this advertisement that is prefaced to all issues of philosophical transactions for the next 200 years. It sets out how the Royal Society makes decisions by its committee, and it makes the point that those committee decisions are based on a judgment of importance and singularity, but without pretending to answer for the certainty of the facts or the propriety of the reasonings, which must still rest on the credit or judgment of their authors. So a decision to publish by the Royal Society in this period does not mean we actually believe what you're saying. We think it's plausible, not glaringly wrong, but we're not saying it's actually true. And I make that point to contrast it with what's going on across the Channel at pretty much the same time at the French Academy, who also, of course, have an editorial committee, but they have the practice of referring out. I mean, they talk about sending out for a rapport. They have rapporteurs. Sending out papers by non-academicians only, by the way. They don't do this to their own papers, to other people's papers. Sending them out for closer scrutiny. So sending it out to a small subcommittee, perhaps 2 or 3 fellows of the Academy, to be asked to do an in-depth scrutiny of that paper, to test its knowledge claims. That might mean repeating the observations. It might mean replicating the experiments. So a positive judgment from the Academy's rapporteurs is a judgment on the truth value of the claims contained in that paper, in a way that the Royal Society's decision to publish was not a comment on truth value. Notice, incidentally, some of you will be interested to know that those rapporteurs had to produce a joint report. So it's a sort of origins of joint peer review, if you're into that sort of thing. However, also notice that the French abandoned this system of testing and replication by the 1830s because it was unsustainable. At the time they're doing that, the British are doing something different. They're introducing refereeing, which is a system you're going to start to see some similarities to modern day now. The Royal Society in particular had come under some criticism that its editorial committee wasn't really doing quite a good enough job of weeding out the trivia and the frivolity and the downright wrong. Because, there was only so many people involved, there were more and more specialisms emerging in scholarship, and the committee members maybe didn't have enough specialist knowledge to make those judgments. So the solution is not to get rid of the committee, but to add another layer, which is the use of referees. Now, the referees are all members of the society, so they still have some status to be a referee, and they're going to produce written reports which will advise and guide the editorial committee. And some of these referees, quite a lot of these referees, took their jobs very seriously. I've got an example up there, just the first and last pages of a 5-page report that's from the 1860s saying, yes, recommend publication. It doesn't necessarily take 5 pages to say that. That should make you think there's something else going on here. We're just not making a straight recommendation. We're giving some justification for that. But we're also doing something else. The authors of these referees' reports are very often pointing out the glaring errors and oversights and perhaps attempts to reason beyond one's available data, but also saying, well, that introduction is awfully long-winded and waffly, maybe you could trim it back a bit and maybe get to the point more quickly. We're seeing stylistic suggestions. We're seeing recommended changes to the style of the paper. What you're also seeing is the expectation that the authors will make revisions to this paper, rather than the French system of judgment, yes, no. What we're seeing here is, yes, looks plausible, but needs a bit of work yet. So there's a change in what refereeing is doing here. I like to see the refereeing system as it developed in the British learned societies as having a close relationship to the oral culture discussion that was also part of those societies. Because you should know that any paper that's up for discussion for publication at the editorial committee has first been read and discussed at an open meeting of the society. So there has been an oral presentation first before you ever got to the committee discussion. And one of the things that the referees reports allows you to do is to continue that discussion in more detail between experts who know what they're talking about, and also indeed for experts who weren't in the room in London when they had that discussion, because the referees didn't have to be London-based. They could be Glasgow-based, for instance. Postal systems have got good enough that this is now plausible by the late 19th century. So you're involving other experts, other colleagues in this. I think the French system can be seen very much as judgment by academicians, state-appointed academicians, on other people, whereas the Learned Society refereeing system is much more about a collegial, at its best, I admit, a collegial discussion between colleagues. I know they also judged people who weren't fellows of the society, but you can see those as being future members of the community rather than seeing them so much as outsiders in the way the French did at this point in time. So by the time we get to the 1860s, 1870s, the system of committees and referees has become fairly common across the Learned Society journals. It is not at all common in any of the independent journals. Okay? Independent journals are still having their editors making their decisions. It's much more time efficient if you've got a monthly, let alone weekly copy deadline, I would point out. Having a refereeing system probably adds about 6 months to the publication process at the Royal Society. Though some referees reported overnight and some of them took 2 years, so there's variability then as now. Not everything changes, but some does. So I want to very quickly look at the Philosophical Magazine again and briefly at Nature. In both cases through the 20th century, we still see editors being in charge of these publications and editors making the majority of the decisions about what to publish. There is some informal refereeing going on. We know that sometimes the editor of Nature would, go down and see a friend at the Athenaeum Club and say, what do you think of this paper? You certainly get that sort of informal seeking of advice, but there's no regular use of refereeing until much later. I've got this example from the Philosophical Magazine up because I think it's a neat example about, again, what publication is supposed to imply here. Oliver Lodge was one of the editors of the Philosophical Magazine in the 1920s, a very well-respected physicist, so a research active, well-published, highly regarded physicist who was the editor. And in 1924, he received a paper from Felix Ehrenhaft on radioactive particles. This is at the height of the revolution from classical to modern physics. And there's a lot of debate going on. Lodge is convinced that the role for Philosophical Magazine is as a forum for debate, for both sides of the debate. So although he thinks that Ehrenhaft's paper was certainly badly written, or maybe badly translated, and almost certainly completely wrong in its arguments, he recommended it be published, and it was published the following year. So notice again, publication doesn't necessarily imply endorsement of what's being published. And if we move on to Nature, a different point from Nature, I particularly like this comment from Walter Gratzer, which appears in Melinda Baldwin's recent article and her just-out book on Nature. From Gratzer, we learned how different things were, even only in the 1950s. Nature, apparently, it was pretty easy to get into, as long as it wasn't outright wrong. So notice again this idea that as long as it's not outright wrong, we're going to publish it. Refereeing was apparently pretty erratic, and they took more notice of where it came from than perhaps of the content. One of the things that's interesting about Nature at this period is that unlike the Philosophical Magazine, which had an active researcher as its editor, the editors at Nature were science graduates who'd become professional editors. They were not themselves active researchers. And so they did have to come up with some kind of proxy for how to make their decisions about what to accept. And one of those proxies was clearly, where did it come from? Did it come from a university we've heard of? Kind of ideally one that's been around for some hundreds of years. Or indeed, does it come recommended by someone we trust? And that's why I've got the DNA article up there. That's Watson and Crick's 1953 double helix article. Francis Crick worked at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. He went to talk about the plans for publication of the DNA model to the head of the laboratory, Sir Lawrence Bragg. Lawrence Bragg supports the idea of sending to Nature and suggests that he'll write a supporting letter to the editor. Why would he do that? Why would you think that having a supporting letter, an endorsement, if you will, from the head of the laboratory would make a difference to the editorial decision? But if you've got the sort of journal we're talking about, where we don't have researchers as the editors, and where recommendations either based on an institution or on someone you trust do matter, then having Bragg, a well-known, trusted sponsor, saying, yes, this is good stuff, you should publish it. Well, why wouldn't you? I'm just pointing out to you a different model of editorial decision-making that was still in place relatively recently. It wasn't until 1973 that Nature started making refereeing a standard part of their editorial procedures. That was with the appointment of David Davis as editor. And just to bang home that point a little bit further, here's the Google Engram of peer review, which of course comes with all the usual take it with a pinch of salt caveats about the corpus it's based on. But I think it makes my point rather nicely that it wasn't until round about 1970 that suddenly everyone started talking about peer review. Now, I hope I've shown you, of course, that there were evaluation and decision-making systems before that. But the emphasis on peer review, almost as a black box magic bullet that is going to guarantee the credibility of science and that is an essential feature of all journals, that's actually very new. So then, this is where we get to the kind of what lessons have we learnt bit. What does this tell us? At the very least, I hope I've shown you all that the publishing practices that we are now familiar with, both the commercial practices about having a commercial transaction for circulating knowledge and the editorial practices with the emphasis on peer review, these are both quite recent. They're post-Second World War developments. They have changed. They no doubt will continue to change. I think too often we assume that the system we currently work in is the natural and inevitable system, that it's always been like this and it always should be like this. Why? History would suggest we shouldn't be thinking that way. I think in particular that the circulation of knowledge hasn't always been seen as a commercial transaction. It certainly wasn't for the societies in the 18th, 19th, even the early 20th century. The commercial model was associated with a different type of journal, the ones more like Philosophical Magazine and like Nature, which have got the news and reviews, the correspondence, the debate, rather than the lengthy original research papers that come out in the other sorts of journals. Similarly, we've seen that peer review things were much more varied, and I hope that you are now thinking a bit more carefully about who should be doing peer review and what is peer review really supposed to do. I feel that an awful lot of the current critiques of peer review arise from unrealistic expectations of what the process of refereeing can actually be expected to do. And if we were a little bit more careful about what we can realistically achieve, then we wouldn't keep saying it was quite so broken. You can muse on that one at your leisure. I'd also very much like you to take away the lesson that I think societies matter a lot, and I'd like to see societies taking a much more active role in the circulation of knowledge. I think partly because societies are representative of those scholarly communities, that matters. They have a shared commitment to the disciplines, but also to the kind of sociological aspects of that, to the oral discussions, to the sharing of research, to the mentoring of junior scholars, to certain patterns of collegiality. Yes, I know there are rivalries as well, but we're going to think positive about this at the moment. These are all things which make peer reviewing work well, but it's, of course, things that don't exist in those many other journals where we don't have societies backing them. So peer review has lost the social underpinnings that it once had. And I think we might want to think about that as well. The other thing that societies can hopefully do is take that bigger picture to realise that if we care about the circulation of knowledge, we might have to find ways to fund that, and that selling knowledge to readers or funding it through APCs is not necessarily the only options available to us. I feel that a lot of the current emphasis in the UK on gold open access, particularly the fact that it's journal-based and that it's to be funded by APCs, is based on the assumption that the commercial transaction is the way that knowledge should be circulated. And I would like to say, well, can't we think differently about that? Because for hundreds of years, people did think differently about that. Now, one of the reasons that the commercial model has come to dominate, I think, is because of the crisis that the learned societies ran into in the 1890s, which was to do with a huge explosion in research outputs and the limitations of print and paper. And those costs did get unbearably high really rather quickly. But we now have the option of different technologies from what were available in the 1890s, technologies that we may hope can deal with the scalability problem in a way that print and paper could not. So perhaps we have a different set of options available to us now than were then available. I think that learned societies, being not-for-profits, have the potential to think more broadly about options for the circulation of knowledge. But I also think that they have the advantage over some of the newer not-for-profits, some of the other sorts of not-for-profits, because they're based in the communities of scholars. That means they're going to have buy-in, well, they can hopefully achieve buy-in from their scholarly communities, because it's all very well coming up with ever more cunning technical ways to circulate knowledge freely and all around the world. But if you don't get the buy-in from the academics, it's not going to change the future of scholarly communication. And that's why I want to see societies do more. And I know you're not all from societies, but that's still my punchline. Thank you.
Any questions for Aileen?
Michael Job, RIN. Just on your last point about the role of societies, some of the data that we have gathered, particularly my colleague Rob Johnson, who's somewhere, demonstrates how dependent a large number of societies, particularly in the UK, have become on the surpluses that they earn from publishing to fund all the other activities which they treat very seriously. Some up to 70, 80, 90% of their other activities depend on those surpluses. And several of them, when you talk to learned society presidents, chief executives and so on, they're like rabbits in the headlights, trying to think, what the hell are we going to do if we lose such a high proportion of the revenues on which everything else we do depends?
Yeah, I know. I think I see that challenge, as a historian and a member of learned societies myself. I mean, I know that my own learned society has transformed its activities over the last 10 or 15 years because of our publishing income. But that has been a recent change. My Learned Society is now a grant-making organisation, and it didn't used to be. So I am very much aware of these arguments. But that's why I think the Learned Societies, they need to have that discussion. It may be that they feel they cannot give up the other new activities they now do. Fair enough if that is the decision they want to make. Or they may be able to say, well, actually, on balance, maybe we want to make a different decision. I mean, I would also suggest that in my ideal redesigned world, if I were queen for the day kind of thing, then rather than talking about the flipping of library subscriptions to commercial publishers, can we not flip that to learned societies to fund their repositories? But, I think we do need to think about how to fund things. When we're thinking about all the financial flows that are involved in publishing, there is money that currently is paying the subscriptions. It could be redirected, and just redirecting it to commercial publishers is only one of those options.
Any other questions? Yeah?
I was just wondering, in your history of peer review, whether you came across any evidence for the effectiveness of peer review in that, or whether there was any independent assessment of whether peer review was working as it was intended to work.
The question is, of course, what counts as working. Yeah. I mean, from the Royal Society's archives, what you get is a picture of, they get along just fine until someone starts critiquing them for what's happening, and then they introduce a new system to something else. So, they were getting along just fine having an independent editor who was under some kind of arm's length, not control, but an arm's length engagement with the society. But then they started being critiqued that this wasn't producing something suitable to the society. So they introduce formal takeover, and they have a committee. And that potters along really quite nicely for the next 80 years or so. And then people start saying, but they're not making good quality judgments. We need to bring in referees. I mean, there hasn't been any major reform since then, actually, which might suggest that it's doing okay. One of the things that very much strikes me about the refereeing system that the Royal Society and other learned societies introduced is the efforts that the referees went to offer advice to authors. And you get, even back then, authors being very grateful to referees for comments. Because I should say that and if you're interested in open and blind and who gets to see these reviews and things, I think in the very early years, 1830s, the referees' reports didn't routinely go back to the authors. But certainly by the time we're into the 1850s and 60s, the editor is sending on extracts or sometimes the entire report to the authors. And sometimes there is a discussion between authors and referees. Sometimes the referees are outing themselves so the authors know who they are. Not always, not consistently. But there is that sense of some back and forth. So I think it's working in the sense of helping authors to improve their papers. Whether it's working in terms of choosing good science, well, the fact that the Royal Society didn't feel the need to introduce another new system suggests that it is broadly working. Where it's not working, I'll tell you, is from a commercial perspective, because that's one of the reasons why the production cost just kept going up, because there's no link between the commercial costs of publishing and what's good scholarship. And so the system selects what seems to be worthy of publishing, and then they just publish all of it. Nobody sits and says, well, actually, we've only got 120 pages to do this in. So that's where it doesn't quite work for them. But that's a slightly different question.
I think it's time for lunch. Is there a question behind?
Well, I don't want to hold up.
No, come on.
A quick question. In 2010, there was an article in PLOS, and that said that the internal consistency of referee reports is appalling, basically, chance. And you mentioned an example of where the referees talked to each other and basically came with a joint recommendation. Is that the only example you know of, or are there any other examples? Because that would certainly address the consistency question.
And that example comes from the French Académie Royale des Sciences in the 18th century. And it's the model that they actually also use for assessing patent applications, just as a by the way, which might be interesting to some. It's a model that seems to have worked for them. The Royal Society in London tried that model briefly. And unfortunately, the first time they tried it, they had two referees who turned out to have rather different opinions of the paper in question. So it was an unfortunate first trial, and it was dropped fairly swiftly thereafter. Alex Sizer at Harvard has written about this. The Royal Society don't seem to have tried it again. We also don't know quite enough about how private these reviews were, whether the referees saw each other's reports or whether the authors saw one or the other. There seems to have been different practices. I think there was a lot of inconsistency, certainly. I mean, I've seen referees' reports in the Royal Society archive that range from one sentence to 10 pages. So clearly. And one of the things I'm fascinated about is in this early phase when refereeing is new, how did referees learn to be referees? Because nowadays, in theory, you can learn from the referees' reports you receive, which may give you either good models or bad models to follow. But in the very early days, you didn't even have that. So it's something I'm still trying to find out, is how did the norms of refereeing get established? Because then I can see them going down from generation to generation in a very informal way.
Do you think they ought to talk to each other? And do you think that if they do, that would add credibility to the peer review process? I'm
coming to think more in terms of the analogy with the doctoral examination, at least as it happens in UK universities, where examiners make independent reports. Then, you wouldn't necessarily have to meet the candidate and interview them, which you do in a doctoral examination. But independent reports then turn into a single combined report. But also, so it's the combination. You've agreed on this. But it's also the report that goes back to the candidate. It is intended to be for the candidate. And I think one of the things we need to think more about refereeing is, who are we actually writing for? Are we writing for the author to improve their paper? Are we writing for the editor to inform their judgment? Or are we making a public statement on how good this paper is and why you should read it? And I think you would write differently for each of those audiences. But I think if people could be persuaded to have the time and invest the time and energy in collaborating on the reviews, yes, I think that would be a good thing. Whether that's workable, I know some people are trying it.
It's time for lunch now. Thank you, Aileen.
Thanks very much.
We